Hi everyone, this is Mackenzie Molnar again for chess.com, and this is the second video in the series about how to play with the initiative. In this game, I decided to choose a game that I've recently seen. It was played at the Gibraltar 2012 Masters between two very strong grandmasters. The white side was Emanuel Berg, he's from Sweden, and the black player was Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, who's a very strong player, young player, and I figured since the last game was played using kind of quieter opening, I wanted to show you that the initiative can develop in any kind of opening. In this game, I decided that I wanted to choose a very sharp game, a sharp opening, and one that's more typical of an opening that you would see with the initiative. And the opening was the Najdorf, which follows like this. Berg, playing the white pieces, chose the sharp line with bishop g5. And this is considered one of the most dangerous lines for black. It's very sharp. It's, along with the English attack, considered probably the most dangerous. And in this position, there are two main moves for black. The threat for white is to take on f6. So black has to come up with a way to deal with this threat. Black normally plays e6 in this position, although recently knight b to d7 has been played by a lot of good players, and it's kind of becoming popular again. In this game, Vachier-Lagrave chose to play the more standard e6. White played f4, and black now chose a variation that is not really a classical one, but is becoming popular also, and he played h6. So the idea for black in this variation is that after bishop h4, he wants to play queen b6, and he's transposing to some of the lines of the normal poison pawn variation, which is one of the most famous variations in all of chess, except now that he has included the move h6 and bishop h4, he's hoping that that will be an improved version for him. The normal variation for white in this position would be to play queen d2, but white chose to play a different move. He played queen d3. And you'll see some of the ideas behind this move as the game progresses. And I figured there's no real better opening than the poison pawn to show how to play with the initiative from the white side, because you're sacrificing a pawn straight off in the opening in order to develop some kind of compensation and sharp attacking play. So black decided to continue and accept the poison pawn. He played queen takes b2. White played the most natural move, rook b1, attacking the queen and forcing black to play queen a3, because that's the only move. In this position, I want you to stop and think for a second, because I think this is a good example of a key idea in how to develop the initiative. One thing you have to always look out for when you're trying to develop the initiative is possible pawn breaks, and in this position, there are two of them for white. And both of them are quite playable and good for their own reasons. And one of the reasons why you have to look out for pawn breaks when you're trying to develop the initiative is because oftentimes it opens up the lines for your pieces, and the more files and open diagonals that you have for your pieces, the better chances that they have to create problems for your opponent. So in this position, white decided to play f5. e5 was also perfectly playable, but he decided to play the more classical variation with f5. And now white has the threat of possibly taking on f6, maybe taking on e6, followed by e5, once again following the principle of trying to open up lines, because let's just say black made a regular move like bishop d7, white can take, and after f takes, there are possible chances with e5 and then the queen coming to g6 with check and creating all sorts of havoc for black, which is, as you can see, one of the benefits of trying to open up lines against your opponent's king, or just in general in the position. And so the best move for black is to play bishop e7 to stop threats against bishop takes f6 and create a possible square on f8 for the king if it ever needs to go there. So black played bishop e7. White continued with the straightforward capture on e6. Black chose to reply with f takes e6, which is the most natural move. Bishop takes e6 would have also been a possibility. After bishop takes e6, the pawn is hanging on b7, so it looks kind of shaky at first, and not only that, the bishop can be captured on e6, and you're giving up the two bishops and possibly the pawn on f7. You'd have to make sure that this variation is completely playable before you can try something like this in a game, and based on the normal theory of the poison pawn, this looks kind of suspicious for black. So he chose to play f takes e6, and white has opened up some lines and some diagonals against the king, but before he can really do anything too serious, he needs to make sure that he's developed all of his pieces and has all of his pieces ready to partake in the action. So he just plays a straightforward bishop e2, which is a nice solid developing move, and this diagonal, the h5 to e8 diagonal, has become a little bit weakened, so the bishop may be well placed there. Black goes ahead and castles, and white does the same. So it looks like we've kind of followed the course of the game as you would expect. Both sides have made natural developing moves once the poison pawn has been accepted. And now it's time for both sides to really start coming up with a plan and developing an idea of what they want to do. So in this position, as you can see, the queen is kind of stranded on a3, and there's may at some point be threats of playing knight to d5 due to the fact that the queen will be unprotected and that the knight, which will be on d5, can take the bishop on e7 with check. And although that might not be anything that's going to be decisive, it could be annoying in the future for black, so black decides to just play king h8, which is a perfectly reasonable move. And white decides to follow along the same lines because he plays king h1, because there is obviously the open diagonal on the g1 to a7, and the white king is just better off in h1. So after this, he'll be ready to conduct the attack or play the position however he likes. So in this position, there are a few choices for black. After black eventually chose to play knight b d7 in this position, which is a very interesting move, he could also have tried a move like knight to c6. And in this position, I want you to think for a few minutes or however much time you need, and I want you to try and come up with a plan for how to continue your attack and how to build your initiative. So black's plan is kind of clear. He wants to either trade on d4, or he may even play knight e5. He can play queen c5 and just really put pressure on all your pieces in the center. And it's clear that he's close to consolidating his position. So now is definitely the best time to take forcing action. So the best line for white in this position would be to capture on c6. And once again, this would be a good example of when to look for a pawn break. So we can see that white's pieces are not really on their most active squares. They could definitely still be improved, because if black plays e5 in this position, all of his pieces will be solid. He'll be ready to develop his light squared bishop, and there will be no way to break through the position anymore. So the best move for white is to play e5 in this position. It looks a little bit risky because you're sacrificing a second pawn, but at the same time, if black accepts, which he's basically forced to do due to the attack on the f6 knight, after d takes e, black's pawn structure is in complete ruins. This bishop on c8 is very hard to get into the game. It's stuck looking at both of these pawns on a6 and e6, and if the only extra pawns for black are on e5 and e6, which are kind of restricting his own pieces, then that's actually a good thing for white. So the best way to keep the initiative going and to put the pieces on the best squares possible for white in this position would be to play queen to g6, which looks very dangerous because you're leaving the knight unprotected on c3. But when we're playing with the initiative, the most important thing is not to let the initiative decrease at all, because if you let your opponent consolidate, then the fact that he's up the material that he's already up will be decisive. So in this position, if you have to sacrifice another knight to make sure that your attack breaks through, then that's just what you have to do. So after queen g6, queen takes c3 would be too dangerous due to the fact that, let's say after bishop takes f6, or any move like that, the bishop will come to d3 with very dangerous consequences. So in this position, black is forced to play bishop d7, and after rook takes f6, rook takes f6, bishop takes, and bishop d3, white has very serious threats. And you've seen that with the pawn on e4 in the starting position, there would have been no way to conduct our attack like this. So definitely if you have a position in which you have the initiative, look for pawn breaks that open up the game for your pieces, because it's very important. So black probably saw that if in this position, if he played knight c6, that it would be very dangerous for him. So he decided to play a move that looked maybe even more natural. He decided to play knight to d7 in this position. So the idea is pretty clear. He wants to either bring his knight to c5 or e5, followed by bishop d7, and he'll have completed his development. He'll have won a tempo by putting the knight on c5 or e5 due to the attack on the queen. So he's ready to basically finish developing all of his pieces, and if he can do that, his position will be very solid, and he'll probably have very good chances later in the game due to his extra pawn. So it's clear in this position that we can't let black achieve what he wants, because if he plays knight c5 or knight e5, we're going to be in trouble, because the pawn that we're down is going to be very important because we don't have enough compensation for what we've given up. So we have to find a way to keep posing problems for our opponent. So do you see any way that you can come up with an idea to stop your opponent's threat of playing knight c5 or knight e5? I think the only way to do it is play a very interesting looking move and take here. This looks very dangerous due to the fact that after knight e5, black is threatening the queen, and not only that, he's threatening the knight on e6. So it looks like there's almost no good way to deal with both threats. The only move would be to play queen h3, but after this, white has put himself in a very uncomfortable pin. There's this knight that's going to be under pressure, this knight that's already under pressure. It's just not a very good situation for white. So he has to be prepared for some other kind of action after knight e5. So the best thing that white can do in this position is play knight takes f8. And that's exactly what the white player did in this position. He's decided that in this position, originally, when black played knight to d7, that even if he has to sacrifice more material, it's worth it, because if you let your opponent consolidate, then you've already basically lost the threat of the game and you have good chances to lose. So he kept the pressure on. He played knight takes e6 and followed it by sacrificing his queen. So after knight takes f8, black is forced to play knight takes d3, or else he would lose large amounts of material. And white threw in the in-between check, knight to g6. So this position is already very interesting. We have a large material imbalance. We've sacrificed the queen, but we'll be getting a decent bit of material back for it. And we're also starting to get rid of some defenders of the black king, which is very useful for us. We have all of our pieces in the game from the white side, whereas black still has two pieces undeveloped, and he has a queen out of play on a3. So the more defending pieces that you can trade, the better for white, because the remaining pieces that black has are not operating at the best of their abilities. So that means if you can get rid of the pieces that black has that are well developed, your advantage of your better placed pieces will be stronger. So after knight g6, black is forced to play king h7. Otherwise, if he had chosen king g8, e7 would have fallen with check. Which definitely do not want that to happen if you're black. So black chose to play king h7. And now I guess this is where we're going to have to come up with another choice, but the choice looks pretty clear, because after taking on d3 with a bishop, we're going to be setting up new threats against the king on the long diagonal, or the diagonal from d3 to h7. And in this position, it's not easy for black to come up with a defense, because, well, although he's gotten a material advantage because he's traded the knight and rook for the queen, his pieces are just very passive, and they're not participating the way that he'd like. So not only that, there's constant threats. There's the bishop that needs to be solved on e7, and if he takes on g6, which happened in the game, e5 is going to be played next and come with strong threats as well. So as I was saying earlier, the more pieces that you can trade off that are defending your opponent's king, the better when the rest of your pieces are placed better than your opponent's. Because you'd rather have, let's say in this position, white has 5 pieces, and after we take on f6, black will have 4 that are in the game. So if the advantage of having 5 well-placed pieces versus, let's say, having 2 or 1 well-placed piece for black is a lot stronger than having 6 on 2, you have a higher percentage of your pieces that are working than your opponent. So it's always good if you can trade off your opponent's defending pieces that are actively placed. So after e5, black is forced to make a choice. He can either play king f7 or he can play king h5. King f7, let's see if you can find a nice attacking idea here for white. After he takes f6, bishop takes f6, it's time to get one final piece into the game. And after knight d5, black's position has completely fallen apart. You've traded off all of the defending pieces for black, and now the rest of your pieces are ready to crash through. Not only that, there's threats of playing knight to b6 at some point. There's no way to stop the threats on the f6 bishop. It's just the position is looking very, very, very bad for black. So in the game, black chose to play king to h5. This was more or less forced, although he's probably already in a losing situation here. So after the natural pawn takes knight, black recaptured with the bishop, hoping to trade off some pieces and maybe lessen the attack. But unfortunately for him, that's not really going to help. After we take on f6, black recaptures. And now you can see that white has all of his pieces operating in the game, and black only has his stranded queen on a3. And part of the strength of having the initiative is creating threats against your opponent. And even though in this position black's king is very open and it's just left helpless, white takes the time to increase the pressure of one of his pieces. His rook on b1 could be doing a little bit better. There's a lot of nice opportunities for it. I mean, maybe it can come to e1 eventually, or it's also exerting pressure on the b7 pawn, but he decides to just play the nice move rook b3. It's preventing the threat to the c3 knight and also increasing the scope of the rook and developing with tempo, which is one of the main ideas with the initiative, is always creating and posing threats for your opponent so that he has to react to you. So after rook b3, black plays queen a5, and the end is pretty near for black here, unfortunately. It's just a matter of looking for the best way to do it. In this position, white found a nice move of playing rook takes f6. He just simply captures the pawn now that all of his pieces are defended, and at the same time, he's not only is he capturing a pawn, he's attacking the pawn on d6, which is not really too relevant. He's more focused on creating checkmating threats, but he's also preventing the king from ever retreating backwards now that the rook is covering the 6th rank. So now, let's say threats like playing bishop e2 are very strong. White may also play even moves like h3 or bishop g6 will be coming with strong ideas. So this position is very, very difficult for black, and he decides that he needs to get the rest of his pieces in the game, but it's already a little bit too late. He plays bishop d7. White plays knight to e4. So now there's the ideas of playing knight g3 or bishop e2 immediately is going to be crushing. So black needs to find something to do. He plays bishop g4 to stop ideas of bishop e2. Now white simply plays h3. He creates a square for his king, so that now there's no possibility of playing any back rank tricks, even though that wasn't a problem before due to the d3 bishop and f6 rook. And he's also creating a threat against the g4 bishop, and will be able to play bishop e2 with devastating consequences. So this position is already lost for black. He has to sacrifice material. He plays rook g8, but unfortunately it's just the beginning of the sacrifices for black. After rook g8, white plays h takes g4. Rook takes g4. It's more or less forced. After bishop e2, black is forced to play queen e1, although in this position it's already lost. White plays king h2, and then he's threatening the rook that was brought up to b3 to protect the c3 knight and create threats against the black queen is now serving its purpose on the third rank. One of the benefits of making moves that create immediate threats for your opponent and improve the position of your own is now that it's fully operational on the third rank, it's ready to deal the checkmating blow. So after king h2, black simply resign because there's absolutely no hope. The rook on g4 is pinned. It's useless. The black king can't move anywhere. And rook h3 is going to be played next turn, and black will be forced to give up the rest of his pieces, and white will be left with at least an extra rook and knight. So this very devastating game, which I really liked, and I was able to see it when it was happening live, and I thought it was a very, very nice game and a perfect example of how to play with initiative.